Hey guys, Matthew here. In today's video, I want to showcase some of my findings, which I think are basically going to be absolutely dominating the future of boss killing for any sort of spellcaster builds. We're talking about getting nearly double the damage on almost any build for very little investment, especially when it comes to Saboteurs, which is what I'll be talking about mostly today. But technically, this can be applied to literally any build in the game. What I'm talking about is essentially having permanent uptime on both Lowlife and Righteous Fire. Now, I do have to give credit where credit is due. This is not my idea whatsoever. This stems from a video from Captain Lance 9, which I'll have linked in the description below. Now, the reason why I'm making a video, despite the fact that this is not something that I found out, is because I had an issue with the way that he went about it. The way that he went about it in his video, which I highly recommend, again, that you watch yourself, because he goes into a lot more details and explaining, the whole idea of Righteous Fire and how it works and the degens and all that, basically the specifics. But the way that he goes about it is that he is fighting off the regen by using a Flask, which he can basically queue permanently. Now, there's a couple problems with that. The biggest problem for me is that you lose the ability to use a Life Flask, which, especially on my League Starter builds, especially on bossing builds, is typically one of your biggest layer of defense is the fact that you have a Life Flask that you can use at any time. And regen is not going to keep you alive on one of those builds, right? They're already very, very squishy, at least my builds typically are when it comes to my League Starters, because they're cheap and they do a stupid amount of damage. So I wasn't willing to give out my Life Flask, but that's pretty complicated because if you don't want to give away your Life Flask, you're going to need to make up a lot of life regeneration in order to fight off the degen from Righteous Fire. So what I have here is a character with about 5,200 life, which is a pretty, reasonable amount of life. Some people would even say it's a little bit high on a minor-based character, especially in a League Start scenario. But nonetheless, I use that because I didn't want to use like a 3,000 life build, because the way that Righteous Fire works is the more life you have, the more damage it does to you. So the harder it is to basically make up for that damage, that degen that you're constantly taking. So let's talk about that real quick and what I think is going to be the best way to go about this. So, like I said, this can be applied to basically any class, but it does get a little bit more complicated, a little bit more annoying with different builds. Miner has or at least Saboteur has Pyromanic, which makes this so incredibly easy. So let's talk about it. What I'm going to be showcasing, again, 5,200 life on a character. If I have literally no regen whatsoever on my build, like 0, right? And I'm level 90, I need to make up 1,155 damage per second. This is how much Righteous Fire is literally just killing me for, right? Which is pretty bad. So, obviously, the first thing we're going to do is grab Pyromaniac. This is going to bring this down to a much more reasonable 637. Now, let's talk about some other things that we can do. Because we are a Saboteur, right, we typically are going to be getting Wind Dancer anyways, and the cool thing about Wind Dancer is that the less damage taken if you haven't been hit recently actually applies to degens as well, right? And because Righteous Fire does not hit, it is a damage over time, this does not trigger whenever you proc Righteous Fire, which means that you are going to have to make up for only 404 life if you go with Wind Dancer. Now, 404 life per second is still a lot of health that you need to make up for. So here's a couple solutions that you have for that. Number one is to go with Vitality. Vitality is about 200 life regen per second. So that's a decent amount, but again, still, we're going to be short about 200. Another solution is to get Consecrated Ground on your build. Now, the downside of that is that you always need to be on Consecrated Ground. Anytime you're not going to be getting that regen. But if you can, however, find a way to always be on Consecrated Ground, using things like Zealotry or Bottled Faith, or even just a regular Sulfur Flask, or even I'll talk about some of the solutions that you have, or some of the options that you have for non-miner builds. But if you can always be on Desecrated Ground, it is about 300 regen per second on a 5.2k life build, which is pretty decent. But my preferred method, and what I think works really, really well for Miner, especially paired with Wind Dancer, is this jewel called Fragile Bloom. So if you've never seen Fragile Bloom, it's because nobody uses this. But what it does is that it gives you fragile regrowth stacks. And these stacks give you 0.7% of life regenerated per second per fragile regrowth, and you have a maximum of 10 of them, which means that on maximum, you're getting 7% of life regenerated per second, which is almost just as strong as the Pyromaniac node, which is absolutely insane. Now, the downside is that you gain one of these charges every second, which means you need to wait 10 seconds to have all 10 charges, and that anytime you get hit, you are losing all of these stacks, right? So, if I have Fragile Bloom, and I have Wind Dancer, and I have Pyromaniac, right? As long as I have all of those, even if I'm not on Consecrated ground, as long as I also have Vitality, you can see that I'm in a positive in terms of my life regen. Now, the downside is that because these are both things that require you not to get hit, if you ever do get hit, you're losing both of them at once. So you're going from a healthy 150 regen per second to a very, very unhealthy minus 440 regen per second. So the problem is here, if you have, let's say, 5,200 life and you're using Petrified Blood, which is what you need to do in order to always stay under the threshold of low life, because the way that Petrified Blood is that the only thing that can bring you out of low life is Life Flask, which is why, like I said at the beginning of the video, I did not want to give up my Life Flask because I did not, I basically wanted to keep that as a panic button for me. So I wanted to make it so my regen alone was fighting out the degen from Righteous Fire, and if there's anything that happens and I do get hit, and therefore I lose, I go to the negative 440 life per second, which is a massive, massive debuff. Now at that point, if I have 5.2k life, that means that I have about 2.6k life because of Petrified Blood taking half my health away. This means that within about 5 seconds, I have 0 HP left, right? Anytime I get hit, which is a massive, massive, hit to my survivability. So the easiest way to make up for that is to use a Panic Life Flask. So what a Panic Life Flask does is it gives you instant recovery when on low life, and as I just mentioned, anytime you have Petrified Blood, you're technically on low life, unless you're spamming your Life Flasks, which is bringing you above that 50%. Which means that this panic button here is recovering 2,160 life instantly, which is, well, remember, we have about 2,600 life, so as long as we're not completely dead, the moment we hit this, we are shooting back up to completely full life, which is huge. Not only that, you can also pair that with Soul as Ryslatha, which gives you 60% increased life recovery from Flask when on low life. So this 2,160 life is actually more somewhere around 3,000 life, which is literally the entirety of your low life health pool, which means when you press this, even if you have 1 HP and you're just about to die, you go right back to full. And one of the really big thing about this flask also is you need Dousing. So what Dousing does is that it basically turns off Righteous Fire. It's the only thing that you can do in this game, pretty much, to turn off Righteous Fire other than reaching 1 life. So here's the thing about Righteous Fire. If I turn it on, right, even if I was to remove the gem, I will keep burning to death because Righteous Fire debuff is just going to stay there, right? So the only thing I can do in order to turn it off is to reach 1 life. The only other thing I can do is to pop a Dousing Flask. If I do that and I pop Dousing, you'll see that it stops the Righteous Fire instantly because it removes all burning when used, and Righteous Fire is a burning debuff. So it is a very, very, very important thing. For example, let's just say that you are doing Maven and you're using this strategy and you hit a laser, which basically makes it so you can't regen any life for like 10 seconds or something. You pop this Life Flask, Righteous Fire goes away, you don't have to worry about regenning because you're not degenning at all, and all of a sudden, you're also full life. It is basically a game changer in terms of strategy to be able to keep your Life Flask available without needing it to fight off the degen from Righteous Fire. Now, the downside, one of the other options that you would have is to use 2 Life Flasks, right? You could use a Life Flask, which is your panic button, and you could use another Life Flask, which is the Life Flask that you're constantly going to be hitting in order to keep the regen higher than the degen, which is what Captain Lance is doing in his video, and the reason why I didn't want to do that, I just explained, right? I want to have my panic button because otherwise it makes it very, very sketchy, especially when just doing regular maps. Anytime you get hit, all of a sudden your life is just dropping down to 0, and there's nothing you can do, right? So having this to turn off Righteous Fire at any moment is clutch as hell. All right, now let's talk about how to do this on any other build that's not a miner, because one thing about it is if you're not a miner, right, you are not going to be getting Pyromaniac, which is the biggest source of regen on the entire build so far, right? If you are not a miner, you are going instantly to negative 366, even with Fragile Bloom and even with Vitality. So your best option is to get Consecrated Ground available on your build. At that point, you'll only be degenning about 55 life per second, and that's really easy to fight off using literally any sort of regen on your build, right? Because this tree doesn't have any sort of regen. I don't have any sort of regen on my clusters, which is very easy to get, basically free, right? Just get a regular cluster that you need and buy one that has 0.2% regen. So something as easy as that can easily fix the problem. Now, however, this does require you to have Wind Dancer. If you don't have Wind Dancer, at this point, you probably need to use the double flask setup where you have your Panic Flask and you have the other flask. Because even with Consecrated Ground, Fragile Bloom at maximum stacks, and Vitality, you are not going to be able to contain this Righteous Fire damage, which is why I think that this is a strategy that is especially great for miners, or at least saboteurs, because you could also do it for trap builds. But for any other build, it's going to be a little bit harder to contain that Righteous Fire damage, but as long as you can, remember that you're getting a multiplicative of 30% from Payment Attunement and 39% from Righteous Fire, which you can actually push even higher using Divergent Righteous Fire, where the buff grants 20% increased spell damage as well. So it's like the 39% more and another 20% increase, which is nothing crazy, but it's still, you know, maybe 1 or 2% damage that you can edge out when we're talking about endgame. So anyways, that's pretty much it for this video. Again, huge thanks to Captain Lance for coming up with this strategy. Now, I don't know if this is something that anybody else has used before, but I wasn't aware of it until this video, which is why I'm giving him the credit. Another thing, actually, that I forgot to mention that I should probably mention real quick is on the other builds that I was mentioning that are not miners, or even on a miner, I would probably recommend using one Surging Vitality Notable. Now, the cool thing about this Notable is that it's item level 1, which means that you can roll it on literally any small cluster jewel that has life on it. So something like this, right? 2 passives or 3 passives, whatever. Added small passive grant life. Even a level 1 can roll this Surging Vitality, and the cool thing about it is it gives you 0.5% life regen per second, which is always active, and then every 4 seconds you regen 10% of your life over 1 second. What that means is that you basically have 3 seconds of complete downtime in terms of regen from this jewel outside of the 0.5%, but 1 second out of 4 seconds you're regenerating 10% of your life, which is a nice little, I guess you could say, way to get you back up to full in case you are running one of these maps like, you know, minus max, where your HP is constantly going lower, or like any sort of degen map like Burning Ground or even Desecrated Ground, right? Something that is constantly working your character downwards in terms of HP. Just having that little surge, right? That little surge of 10% every 4 seconds is one that I would probably recommend using, even on a miner, even if you can contain all that damage, right? Like I was saying, and have permanent uptime without any uses of Flask and all that. This is one thing that will help you a lot in case you do get hit, right? If you do use lose those fragile regrowth stacks and the Wind Dancer stack, right? If you lose all that, all of a sudden you're gonna feel you're basically just going to be dropping HP. And yes, you have the Flask, but another thing that can keep you alive is that Surging Vitality Jewel, which I highly recommend using one of. Now, I don't think you should stack them, but you could if you wanted to. I guess it all comes down to how much life you have. I mean, the 0.5% life regen per second is already pretty good on its own. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the video. Before I go, I want to say a huge thank you to my supporters: Kat, Alex, Brandon, Nate, the other Alex, Flame Scorpion, Neroth, Grimoire, the Great Master, Johnny, Thomas, Mass, Reese, Tim, Axel, Road to Millions, Atticus, Scott, Stan, Zarashi, welcome back, Wolverine, Ronald, Kevin, the third Alex, Bitizen, and Mercury, as well as, of course, anybody else who has supported me in the past and anybody else who wishes to remain anonymous. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.